It's a beautiful day, so thanks for taking the time to come and hear Tavleen's work today. It's a real pleasure and honor to continue to present our NFC Doctoral Fellows for this year. We've had 2 talks already, and now we'll have our 3rd, and on Monday there'll be the 4th. But it's a real pleasure to introduce Tavleen Purewal. She's a PhD candidate and course instructor in the Department of English. Her previous and ongoing work explore the affects of solidarity in Dion Brand and Lee Maracle, Black diaspora and Black indigeneity in M. Norbese Philip, Black Lives Matter Toronto Poetics, Black Indigenous Miscegenation, and the Black Canadian documentary poem. Her talk today is called Torn Intimacies, Lawrence Hill's Memoir and the Interruptions of Black Indigenous Miscegenation. I'd like to thank Amelia for organizing, doing all the organization, Jamie for making the wonderful poster, and now please, Tavleen, take it away.
Okay, I'm supposed to be, let me just fix this screen share. I'm supposed to be screen sharing something. I hope you can see it on your screens. Okay, great, thank you. So, hi everyone, thank you so much for joining today, and thanks to Bob and Amelia, of course, for organizing today and for organizing the doctoral lecture series. I feel very lucky to be a part of it. This background photo in this slide I have is of Colborne Street in Oakville, Ontario. It's now known as Lakeshore Road, I think, and it was taken in 1938. And Oakville is going to be an important place for my talk today. So I'm coming to you via Zoom from my uninvited position, uninvited settlement in Toronto. According to First Nations House magazine, Toronto is defined in the Wendat language as a fishing weir constructed of standing sticks in the water, and more broadly, a gathering place due to the highly transnational character of this territory. A vast network of waterways and creeks made it possible for different Indigenous nations to meet for trade and kinship. I'm located specifically in the Church and Wellesley area, where a waterway stemming from Lake Ontario ended. That waterway is now Jarvis Street, vanished like other waterways that have been altered or destroyed by settler invasion. Now, this part of Toronto was particularly colonized by the Jarvis family, who owned 6 enslaved Black peoples. In the lead up to the 1793 anti-slavery legislation, the patriarch William Jarvis vigorously opposed the laws, causing delays. He later sought court approval to punish 2 enslaved Black peoples who had escaped from his mansion. His son, on the other hand, embezzled money and stole land from the Mohawk Nation. This is where I'm living today, and this history reminds me that my settler of color presence is complicit with and structured by the modern colonial and capitalist state that people have astutely conceptualized as co-constituted by anti-indigeneity and anti-Blackness. So a commitment to examining this condition and the possible forms my racialized presence may take when understood in the context of Indigenous sovereignty and Black liberation is what drives the work I do in my dissertation. My work started in early 2015. I was an undergraduate student at a graduate student conference at McGill, where I first heard Ronaldo Walcott in a keynote address articulate Black liberation as the freedom of global movement and a refusal of land, home, and belonging. Black people are creatures of the sea, he had said. When back at Simon Fraser University, where I was a student, I brought up Walcott's talk with Nadine Chambers, who at the time was the coordinator for the Women's Center, and now is a brilliant researcher working on the entanglements of resource extraction in Jamaica and in Haisla territory in BC. She urged me to continue thinking about this question I had come away with about Walcott's conception of land and whether he considered Indigenous epistemologies of land. So I can draw a fairly straight line from these formative intellectual experiences to my current doctoral project and scholarly interests. Black scholars provided and continue to provide me with the language and understanding to thoughtfully examine racialized presences and kinships on Turtle Island. My project is shaped by an ongoing debt to these Black mentors from then and now. So my dissertation examines Black and Indigenous relations as they emerge in an archive of contemporary Black Canadian literature. The works of Dion Brand, Lorena Gale, Lawrence Hill, George Eliot Clark, Troy Burrell Bailey, Wade Compton, Cecily Nicholson, and Kay Kalu depict a set of complex historical, political, and affective relations between Black, Indigenous, and Indigenous communities. These relations appear textually in these works within inscriptions of indigeneity. By inscriptions, I mean both intertextual references and the intentional and non-intentional unexpected presences of indigeneity. Inscription here is understood in contrast to representation and its power dynamics. And I think of indigeneity as constituted by what Sarah Hunt and Sarah DeLeo describe as the everyday, ongoing, and relational. Inscriptions of Indigenous characters, Indigenous histories, and conceptions of land that I talk about take very different forms depending on which Turtle Island, Indigenous nations, histories, and epistemologies contextualize them. Thus, by attending to certain textual moments in Black Canadian literature, I also get to examine Coast Salish oral narratives, Ojibwe femininity, 18th century enslaved Indigenous women, Mohawk resistance, and more. For instance, Afro-Métis writer and professor George Eliot Clark's negotiation of the hereditary ties between Blackness and indigeneity alerts me to the discourse of the Métis nations and other nations' conception of Indigenous mixed race identifications. I also do not hesitate to note where indigeneity appears stereotypically. To borrow the phrasing of Richard Fung, people of color, quote, who are not aware of the historical context and are fed a narrow diet of Aboriginal stereotypes in the media, can become a tool in delegitimizing Aboriginal rights, end quote. So as you can see, the presence of such different inscriptions of indigeneity in this archive highlight the very complicated character of Black and Indigenous relationality. Today, I'll outline some of the critical and methodological contexts for my dissertation before examining Lawrence Hill's memoir, Blackberry Sweet Juice on Being Black and White in Canada. His memoir is about Black and white mixed race experiences in Canada, but an unexpected chapter about a novel Hill had written previously gestures to the lived experiences of Black Indigenous peoples. Hill struggles to understand these experiences and ends up feeling hurt and rejected, which is represented in a way that exemplifies the form of Black feeling I'm interested in my project. For now, I want to briefly consider some well-known critical works that you may have encountered on this dissertation topic. In his essay, Diasporas for Cultural Anthropology in 1994, James Clifford very famously conceptualized diaspora in negation. He writes, diasporas are caught up and defined against, 1, the norms of nation states, and 2, Indigenous and especially autochthonous claims by tribal peoples. This pairing of nation states and indigeneity in binaric relation to diaspora is dangerous, as it abstracts ideas about Indigenous sovereignty and determines nationhood as intrinsically nativist. The hazards of this thinking are exemplified in Nandita Sharma's very recent book, Home Rule, though Sharma briefly states that Indigenous conceptions of sovereignty are unlike nation-state conceptions. She ultimately collapses differences in the following argument. All nationalisms are fundamentally autochthonous and productive of a hierarchical separation between national natives, autochthons, and migrants, allochthons. Such oppositions are also produced by the Afro-pessimist works of people like Jared Sexton and Frank B. Walderson. While these thinkers bring clarity to the anti-Black foundations of modernity, they also insist on the non-alliance of so-called Blackness and indigeneity. For example, Walderson identifies 3 ontological categories operating in America: the savage, the settler master, and the slave, racially eluded by his 2010 book title as Red, White, and Black. He saddles the Indigenous and white settler subjects against the enslaved Black subject because the two apparently share a capacity for producing place. This argument pushes reductive claims like Sharma's to their problematic limits. These three instances demonstrate a field of thought that pronounces diasporic and Indigenous subjects as structurally antagonistic. Meanwhile, in the Canadian literary context, critics and writers were fighting for the very possibility of exploring and nurturing these relations, these subject relations. For example, in the same year that Clifford published Diasporas in 1994, Canadian writers of color confronted a very hostile political climate when trying to center Indigenous and diasporic dialogue at the Writing Through Race conference. The organizing committee faced immense backlash over their decision to reserve daytime events for Indigenous and non-Indigenous people of color participants. Anger about the supposed exclusion of whiteness, fueled by very malicious news titles like the Globe and Mail's A Nasty Serving of Cultural Apartheid, even reached the House of Commons, and they took away funding from the conference. Also have slides of the Orion Nebula for when I don't have visual cues and don't want your focus on words and pictures. So Larissa Lai, a Asian Canadian writer and professor and an original member of the Writing Through Race organizing committee, remembers a panel that was organized at the Writers Union AGM to mediate this national debate. She was especially struck by Black Canadian writer Makeda Silvera's talk, which began as, quote, "I hate this kind of forum, to explain to a group of white people why we have to have this conference," end quote. Through her anger, Silvera signaled a deep desire for steadfast alliances between racialized communities against the derailing effects of white feelings and its discursive violence. This flashpoint of Canadian racial politics, which are otherwise disavowed by a culture of liberal multiculturalism, exemplified a prohibition on cross-racial relations that neither involve nor are mediated by whiteness. This flashpoint also illuminates the ongoing, new, and urgent work being done to enact and think about these anti-racist and decolonial relations. To this end, my work is indebted to the brilliant work of critics like Rita Wong, Larissa Lai, Sophie McCall, Leanne Batasmasak-Simpson, Bonita Lawrence, Enakshi Dua, Zainab Ahmadai, Karina Vernon, Cheryl Suzak, George Elliott Clark, Lee Miracle, Nadine Chambers, and many others who have shifted the epistemic terrains of Canadian literary criticism. Institutionally, the Trans-Canada Institute and its publication series has played a major role in making space for these studies and conversations. And while there continue to be institutional barriers to this work, this genealogy of critical writing, or what Karina Vernon calls critical genealogy, for my project is like no other. So this highly interdisciplinary scholarship on indigeneity and diaspora shares a few methodological characteristics, and I'll speak about two of them. First, in the echoes of Makeda Silvera, whiteness as a discursive, affective, and organizing entity is decentered. The methodological frame instead reveals alignments and tensions between racialized experiences and histories that have been invisibilized. This does not mean, however, that the structural role and conditions of white settlerhood in Canada are unimportant. Critics have sharply clarified the conditions and legacies of the transatlantic slave trade, slavery, settler invasion, and the genocide of Indigenous nations, racist immigration policies, the Multiculturalism Act, and other state violence, for how they structured and continue to mediate particularly Indigenous and Black relations. For example, anti-Black and anti-Indigenous elimination tactics converge to territorialize large parts of Canada for European settlement, while the implementation of Section 18.1 of the Indian Act, setting Indigenous populations apart onto small reserves, was in full force. In 1910, an immigration ban on, quote, any race deemed unsuited to the climate or requirements of Canada, end quote, targeted peoples attributed with connections to Africa. This history conditions the absence and presence of cross-racial relations, and yet Black and Indigenous peoples maintain relation and collectively subvert its effects. Now, the second characteristic of the scholarship on indigeneity and diaspora emphasizes the shared histories of oppression, including the violence of global capitalism and imperialism, as points of comparison and as conditions for relation. While the scholarship understands how the history of anti-Black and anti-Indigenous modernity is ultimately lived in very divergent, dissonant, and irreducible experiences, there have been efforts to trace a shared set of concerns within a comparativist framework. As an example, consider Tiffany Lethwell-King's work, which is taken up as African American studies, but it began at OISE at U of T, and she discusses Canada as well as the US. Published in 2019, her book, The Black Shoals, Offshore Formations of Black and Native Studies, is my dissertation project's most immediate predecessor. With regards to the first methodological characteristic of similar scholarship, King decenters whiteness in a trenchant critique of Western humanist discourse, as it underpins what she calls white settler colonial studies. She examines how Western humanist discourses produce Black and Indigenous subjects as non-human matter, as flesh. The discursive paradigm reproducing this genocidal logic and practice is the terrain upon which King sets the terms of engagement between Black and Indigenous studies. She writes, rather than speaking only in the terms of vocabulary of liberal notions of Indigenous sovereignty and Black citizenship, what Frank Wilderson terms Black and Native grammars of suffering have space to produce utterances. No longer drowned out by humanist hymns, the Black and Native choruses, harmonies, and dissonances that ring can be taken up on their own terms, flesh moaning and humming to more flesh. The personification of Black and Indigenous relationality as flesh moaning and humming to more flesh creates a really powerful image. The differently shared experiences of bodily and epistemological violence demand their own vocabularies within and beyond the Western paradigm of humanism. But King here is revealing the conditional that shapes her conceptualization of the encounter between Black and Indigenous studies. If one were to center the Black or Indigenous bodies' re-articulation through conquest and genocide, they could take part in this conversation that she has set. As King's book demonstrates, hers is a vital conversation that hails a community of Indigenous and Black scholars for more dialogue. But I depart from such comparative frameworks that require setting already agreed upon terms of engagement. As I hope to demonstrate in the example from Lawrence Hill's work, a crosstalk that speaks to epistemological differences in a chaotic way that potentially ends up undermining the dialogue reveals aspects of Black and Indigenous relationality that can slip through conversations that are structured by very tight conceptual frames. In my dissertation, it's the inscriptions of indigeneity in Black Canadian texts and the Black affective epistemologies that emerge in response to these inscriptions that guide the terms of encounter between Blackness and indigeneity. There is an echoing, mobile, and interrupting network of call and response that I attempt to study. And I give this very shifting network some structure by drawing on affect theory to understand modes of Black and Indigenous relationality signaled by Black feelings. This overall method allows me, for example, to hold the narratives of Black, Indigenous, and Black Indigenous peoples together in one study, which hasn't been done before. This method also, I hope, resists fixing terms, especially indigeneity and Blackness. I will now turn my focus to my study of Lawrence Hill's memoir, which animates and expands on the kind of literary analysis made possible by such a methodology, and that also thematizes this idea of crosstalk. People may have heard of Lawrence Hill after his novel, The Book of Negroes, became an international bestseller in 2007. Over 1 million copies sold globally, making Hill the most widely read Black Canadian author. But before he took us across the Black Atlantic through the neo-slave narrative of Aminata, Hill had written a memoir titled Blackberry Sweet Juice on Being Black and White in Canada, published in 2001. Woven into his personal narrative of mixed race experiences are stories from 34 interviewees that Hill had met across cities in Canada. Hill tries to negotiate the very different contested ideas about identification and community. For example, some Black women interviewees share their frustrations and insecurities about Black men dating white women. More Fanonian than segregationist, they know that interracial relations can sometimes serve certain Black psychosocial desires for whiteness and the affordances of being proximate to it. As a Black man in a relationship with a white woman, and also the product of such an interracial couple, Hill rejects the disciplinary potential of such ideas by stating, let them make love and let them be. But he still gives the righteous anger of these interviewees space and voice. In the penultimate chapter of the memoir, Hill recasts the themes of racialization and interracial love for the encounter between Blackness and indigeneity. In the chapter, he revisits his novel, Any Known Blood, that was published in 1997, 4 years before this memoir. And he revisits this novel to share some of his misgivings about the way he represented the historical figure Ira Johnson. Hill erased aspects of Johnson's history that he now realizes animate a very central concern in his memoir, that, quote, race is nothing but a social construction, end quote. But as I will demonstrate, Ira Johnson's history animates something more and emerges as crosstalk challenging Hill's conceptions of Black mixed race experience. So Hill first heard Ira Johnson's story during an interview with Alvin B. Aberdeen Duncan of Oakville, Ontario, a prominent figure in the Black community who preserved the city's rich Black history from oral stories, books, personal experience, and newspapers. In his capacity as chairperson of the Oral History Committee at the Ontario Black History Society, Hill first interviewed Duncan in 1991. Almost halfway through the interview, Duncan refers passingly to a day in Oakville on February 28, 1930, when his sister witnessed 40 members of the Ku Klux Klan burn a large cross to intimidate a Black, I'm so sorry if you heard that. That was some kind of construction happening. Okay. She witnessed 40 members of the Ku Klux Klan burn a large cross to intimidate a Black man, Ira Johnson, into ending his relationship with Isabella Jones, a white woman. Duncan remembers that the local police authority, Chief Kerr, deterred the Klansmen and later arrested a few of them who turned out to be from nearby Hamilton. Now, there's no photo from that day of the KKK in Oakville, but this is a photo of a KKK march in Hamilton in 1930, and some of the people present in this photo may have actually been present on that day threatening Ira Johnson. Despite the KKK's threatening presence, Ira Johnson was not easily menaced. Duncan recalls, quote, he claimed he was an Indian, end quote, and he completely renounced his Black identity, which allowed him to marry Jones. But Duncan considers this claim to be solely strategic. Oh, he was definitely Black. Oh, he was known in the community. Believing that the Black community could attest to Johnson's true identity, Hill also remains incredulous. That must have had the Black community in stitches. It seems really funny to me. Duncan replies it was both funny and sad. It marks Johnson's ingenious and unexpected act of resistance, unveiling the comedically contradictory structure of Canada's racial stratification system, while also symbolizing the sexual unfreedom of Black people in Canada, transcended only by rejecting their Black identity. Both Duncan and Ira Johnson inspired Hill's representation of the character Aberdeen Williams in any known blood. That novel follows a character, Langston Kane V, a Black and white mixed race man who embarks on a writing journey to uncover his patrilineal history through 5 generations. Kane's archival research into his family reveals secret and contentious interracial relationships in ways that establish the novel in the tradition of miscegenation literature. The term miscegenation was coined by anti-abolitionist journalists in New York in 1863 and articulated colonial anxieties about Black blood and sexual relations supposedly threatening white racial integrity. Miscegenation literature then represents the violent effects of these anxieties and represents the trials of usually Black, white, mixed race protagonists. Hill's novel follows these narrative conventions to some extent, but represses the potential history of Black Indigenous miscegenation and the colonial anxieties around that of Ira Johnson that inscribe the character of Aberdeen Williams. In the novel, the violence of the 1930 event in Oakville is toned down, while Johnson's claims to indigeneity are completely left out. For example, the threats of the KKK in the novel are resolved when the local police chief comes to restore order. And as Hill admits in his memoir, he made members of the KKK look like buffoons, which led certain readers of the novel to celebrate Canadian justice and underestimate the violence of the KKK in Canada. Just to clarify, while loosely organized nationally, the KKK in 20th century Canada operated as community-led branches. And anti-miscegenation, while not a law in Canada, was a largely social discourse that threatened and prohibited interracial relationships. In contrast to Hill's relatively benign narrative, the real Ira Johnson faced vicious anti-Black and anti-miscegenation responses by authorities in both Oakville and Toronto, who condoned the actions of the KKK that day. And only one of the Klansmen was ever convicted and given a 3-month sentence. Amidst this climate and really committed to marrying his white lover, Isabella Jones, Johnson performed a transgressive racial act, which Hill takes up in his memoir after having left it out of his novel. So in a series of interviews with the Toronto Daily Star, published a week after the KKK visit, Johnson claimed he had exclusively Cherokee and European heritage. Johnson was obviously hyper aware of the hemispheric reach of the one-drop rule, the legal principle in the US. The first article on Johnson's Indian, Scotch, Irish, and Spanish heritage clarifies that his maternal grandfather, though of Scottish and English parents, preached in the African Methodist Episcopal Church because his Cherokee wife was, quote, so dark that some objections had been taken to her by members of white congregations, end quote. Non-racial affiliations with the Black community established, the short article goes on to authenticate Johnson's claims, printing his account of Indigenous and European ancestors from Indiana and Maryland, a history that the newspaper confirms by noting his physical and behavioral traits. They say he is quiet and unassuming in his demeanor, and his features reveal his Indian connection. His hair is black and straight. One of the last pieces of the puzzle was authenticating Johnson's identity with local Indigenous members' testimonies, which the Star provides while covering the story of Johnson and Joan's wedding. So struggling to locate a minister who would wed them, Johnson turned to his friend Dan Laforme, who took the couple to the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation at New Credit Reserve, where a white pastor married them. This cross-racial friendship corroborates Johnson's indigeneity. Laforme does not comment on Johnson's racial identity, but states, I've known Ira since he was 10 years old. Johnson's lifelong friendship with an Indigenous man demonstrates to the public that his self-identification as Cherokee is community-based and affirmed. Especially considering the contrary, the articles make no reference to Johnson's friends and families in the Black community. Therefore, to perform a socially recognizable Indigenous identity, Johnson employs devices of authentication not unlike those federally and socially mandated for Indigenous political and cultural membership: self-identification, proof of ancestral connections, recognizable racial traits, and both white, the Toronto Daily Star staff, and Indigenous community member references attesting to the authenticity of one's claims. Despite the assertion of Indigenous rather than Black blood, Johnson's multiple descent ancestry remains ambiguous. Lawrence Hill concludes that Johnson and his family were listed as being Black and of African ethnic origin in the 1901 Canada Census. But historical and institutional problems with the Canadian Census in recording mixed race identities could have led to a reductive racialization at best and a complete miscategorization at worst. And to seriously consider Johnson's claims to Cherokee ancestry, we can also think about the politics of his family's representation through the struggles of the Cherokee freedmen and descendants, who in the 19th and 20th centuries try to gain federal and tribal recognition as both Black and Cherokee people. The lack of understanding around Johnson's family history can be contextualized in part by this history of the statistical and institutional repression of Black Indigenous peoples in the US and Canada. Given Johnson's racial performances as Cherokee and Black, the latter witnessed by the Black community in Oakville, I understand his heritage as Black, white, and Indigenous. And when he performatively rejected the presence of Black ancestry, Johnson revealed the aporia at the heart of white supremacist logics underpinning these very systems of racial categorization and morality. The anti-miscegenation system of beliefs remained in place, that Black and white people cannot intermarry, while its efforts to obstruct the relationship were thwarted. Johnson may have lived with the secret relish of being partly Black and married to a white woman with the attenuated blessings of the media. Lawrence Hill, however, experiences a range of emotions as he narrates this history. When he first told his father, Daniel Hill, who, fun fact, was the first director of the Ontario Human Rights Commission, Daniel Hill howled with laughter. Did he think that would save his ass? That the Klan would look any more favorably on his being an Indian than a Black man if he were going to be taking a good white girl into his bed? His father's incredulity here suggests he took Johnson's act as a gimmick. Gimmicks are tricks or schemes for marketing that can appear comedic due to their desperate and laborious structure. According to Sayan Nagai, the gimmick either provokes laughter against the absurd system that requires such tricks or against itself as it appears too complicated for the intended effects. Daniel Hill's laughter can be situated against both Johnson's performance, to repeat his word, did he think that would save his ass, and the systemic racializing structures of Canada. Hill's response mirrors his father's, but also bespeaks the deep pain he felt encountering the renunciation of Blackness. He evokes a set of imagery to paint Johnson as a gimmicky and subversive force. If you ask me, Ira Johnson proved himself as Canada's first spin doctor. The real genius of Ira Johnson's bombshell wasn't that he said he wasn't Black. It was that he gave Canadians something else to hang on to, a Cherokee heritage. Ira Johnson successfully transformed his own racial identity by means of one interview with the Toronto Daily Star. As usual, race was only an issue when Canadians made it one, and in his most difficult hour, when the pressure was ballooning all around him, Ira Johnson, with one deft pinprick, made all the hot air dissipate by simply, cleverly, and irrevocably trading one racial identity for another. The thematic coherence of Hill's descriptions, like first spin doctor, real genius, simply, cleverly, and the cynicism fermenting in the image of the balloon pop, represent Johnson's performance as the amusing and acrobatic maneuvers of the gimmick. Nagai suggests that the gimmick produces ambivalence in the audience. It's funny but off-putting, and it's a suspicious spectacle. She writes that as a device, it paradoxically, quote, seems both to work too hard and too little, end quote. While Daniel Hill, his father, laughs at the laboriousness of Johnson's scheme, it works too hard, especially as there is no guarantee that Indigenous peoples have more sexual freedom than Black peoples, Hill thinks that the performance works too little. Aware of the different interviews Johnson had done with the Toronto Daily Star, Hill ignores all that effort when he states Johnson successfully transformed his own racial identity by means of one interview. Hill resents how immediately the gimmick succeeded to assuage media and public outcry. Everyone was ready to accept anything but Black. And Hill appears incredibly hurt and rejected as a Black man witnessing the reproduction of anti-Black norms and the total disavowal of Blackness. He seems to wonder why no one fought to affirm Johnson's Black identity and assert the right of Black peoples to sexual freedom. For him, the gimmick worked too little to oppose anti-miscegenation discourses. Up until the end of the chapter, Hill wants to affirm and collect evidence that Johnson was Black, at least partly, to perhaps believe that Black interracial love and life as a Black man within the Black community of Oakville was compatible. At the same time, Hill's responses of humor and hurt cast Black indigeneity and its different performances into the realm of the impossible. He admits that Johnson, quote, may have had both Black and Indian ancestry, something that is common among North American Blacks, end quote. But he cannot contextualize Johnson's performance within a racial history in which Black Indigenous people struggle for both treaty status and recognition as mixed race peoples against totalizing racializations as only Black. Hill reduces Ira Johnson's instrumentalization of indigeneity, Black Indigenous experience, and disavowal of Blackness to a gimmick and not a host of complex performances to make himself legible in a certain way to access certain rights, namely to marry whomever he wants. Hill remains torn, ambivalent, and pulled apart in the face of a seemingly illegible history in which Blackness, an experience and ontology that has been a formative yet deferred presence in his life as a Black-white mixed race man, was wholly disavowed and rejected by someone else. So it's this aesthetics of ambivalence that my dissertation takes up. I specifically theorize the term torn intimacies, the production of intimacy through ambivalent feelings between Black, Indigenous, and Black Indigenous subjects, to think about how negative feelings can be sites of relation, solidarity, and collectivity. Other texts in my project more explicitly represent how Black ambivalence to indigeneity, produced by the historical tensions of colonial violence, can develop certain intimacies between Black Indigenous peoples. But in Lawrence Hill's memoir, the absent present inscription of Black indigeneity primarily produces feelings of hurt and rejection for Hill. Nevertheless, by being forced to contend with new questions about belonging and community for Black mixed race peoples due to this Black Indigenous experience, I suggest that there is an opening in Hill's thinking with the potential for desiring Black Indigenous and Black Indigenous collectives that are not built on disavowing one another and the relational nature of racial identity. So that's all I have to say. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Tavleen. Fantastic talk, very, very thought-provoking. Lots of different angles, I think, for discussion. We've got time, and I invite anyone to raise their hand. We're a small group, so you can just raise your hand or unmute and ask Tavleen a question or contribute something. Yes, Christina, please.
I guess I should lower my hand. That was amazing, Tavleen. Excellent work. I learned so much from that talk. I always learn so much from your work, and today was no different. There's a couple of things I was just really curious about when you were kind of outlining your project that I wanted to hear a little bit more about. The first was you talked briefly about inscription in the beginning, kind of in contrast to representation. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about how you see those things as opposed or connected. And then you were very clear about this, but you mentioned that the approach that you're taking is allowing you to kind of explore Indigenous storytelling traditions or epistemologies, like in a very localized way, depending on which texts and traditions you're working with. And then there's this kind of tension here between that and then like the need to unpack and attend to stereotype. And that seems like a difficult choice to me to make at some points, right? Like, at which point do you kind of like explore this reference as like a way into something, as a way into a particular tradition, or is it a stereotype that's doing something else? And so I'd love to hear about like how you navigate that tension. Sorry, that was 2 questions, but you can handle it.
Thanks so much, Christina. Thanks for so thoughtfully engaging with my work always, but especially today. So like really, really important questions that I rack my brain over. So in terms of inscriptions versus representation, it came like, what I mean by representation is this sometimes, sorry, I don't know if you can hear that, but this construction noise is like deafening to me, but I don't mean representation as large, like as a field of mimetic representation. Like I understand representation happens in very unique, interesting ways, but I'm thinking about when something is representing something, like that kind of dynamic, it creates a weird power dynamic where indigeneity can then become the represented over and over again, and it kind of fixes it and then objectifies it. And so that's why, as opposed to indigeneity being represented by these works, I'm thinking of indigeneity inscribing the work. So it really allows me to think about obviously intentional intertextual references, Indigenous stereotypes, and all those kinds of things, or stereotypes of indigeneity, but it also like gives me some control to think like, oh, this piece of land or this island is being focalized in this story. For example, there's like so many, Indigenous oral stories that live within parts of the land. And so I can see how they come up in certain Black texts, because I feel like if a Black Canadian text is interested in a relationship to Indigenous conceptions of land, is committed to Indigenous sovereignty, like it has those claims at the forefront, then if it's, representing or narrating their story on a piece of land, that land speaks itself in the story. So that's how I think of inscription as different from representation. The second one, Indigenous epistemologies versus stereotypes. So I haven't luckily chosen texts that represent indigeneity through very stereotypical images. They appear in Austen Clarke, and I thought, I'll just leave Austen Clarke. I don't need that. But then there will be some of those I'll have to tackle in Dion Brand's work. And so right now I haven't had to deal with that. So I'll let you know how it goes. But I know that, there's bound to be misunderstandings and these stereotypes. And why I really like the Richard Fung quotation about, people of color misrepresenting or not knowing the history is because it doesn't make it the mistake of the author or of the character who understands indigeneity stereotypically. We get to think about the system that creates this kind of relationship between these two communities where they have these deep misunderstandings, or how the system kind of stacks people against one another so that your liberation is dependent on the non-liberation of other people. So that gets animated in those interesting moments where there are stereotypes. I mean, they're very uncomfortable, but they bring up really important kind of historical contemporary political work. So I haven't had to do that yet, but maybe in the Dion Brand chapter, I'll write in the summer.
Great. Any other questions? And I appreciate your honesty regarding corpus selection. Often, because often we kind of just elide these questions, right? But it is very helpful to talk, and especially for people who are moving along in their projects, right? To be honest and say, okay, well, sometimes this is how we select works and how it helps us move forward the ideas we want to explore, right? Any other questions, comments? Tavleen, maybe this is a totally ignorant question, but I was just wondering, because you did mention sort of using affect theory and stuff, how is ambivalence treated in affect theory? And I like that kind of triangle you kind of constructed of ambivalence and intimacy and affect theory together.
I've seen it most, I think in the ways that it's most relevant to my work, I've seen ambivalence being theorized as this kind of negative affect that has diagnostic capacities, that has political potential. It's not going to be transformative. It's not going to change the world. Affect's not, treated that way in those kinds of theories. So I've seen it in Cyan Nagai's work, obviously. Even David Cherryamby, who's a Black Canadian writer, he's reading Dion Brand and he notes all this ambivalence. And so I'm in that strain of affect theory that looks at problematic or awkward or weird affects and then wants to see, or not wants to see, but actually sees the political potential in them. And yet ambivalence for especially Black feeling is crucial because it always unsettles the Black subject. It reminds them of their displacement, of their diasporic kind of subjectivity. So it works in a very, very pointed way for Black feeling, but that's how I'm contextualizing it within affect theory.
Cool. And it seems too like the comparativist framework you're working on is kind of like a new way of looking at comparative type literatures, right? Or what?
Yeah, well, I hope so. I just have only encountered this topic represented where there's like an Indigenous voice paired with a Black voice. And there's so much that, gets reduced in those kinds of comparative frameworks. And so by situating myself pretty firmly in Black Canadian literature and then allowing that conversation to emerge. So I'm privileging Black feeling, I'm privileging Black historical experience, but I want to see how those things shift when in conversation with Indigenous studies and literatures and politics. But then it was Tiffany Lethbo King who I think changing that a little bit, like she did something different in her book where she's saying Black studies can be better if they take this part of Indigenous studies, and Indigenous studies will be better if they understood this part. So she was creating a more interesting dialogue. But the focus on one, field and then focusing that another field through inscriptions, I haven't seen that before.
Great. Cool. We've got Bradley saying thank you. And I guess too, the concept of sovereignty in different settler conditions, right? And the relationships, what sovereignty means here in Canada regarding, in terms of other nation states too, right? Is a very loaded question as well. Okay, well, if there's no other questions, then what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna paste the upcoming events. But first of all, let's please thank Tavleen very much.
Oh, there's I think 2 questions or.
Oh, is there? Okay.
By Sherry. Oh,
Sherry, do you have a question?
No, I was just going to say, I think Katja had a question.
Okay, I can't see the hand.
I don't have a question, but I have a comment. I found it very pertinent and very fascinating because I don't know a lot, about, I deal with Blackness, but in the Caribbean context and not in the Canadian context. So I learned a lot. But I think that we can also, I think there's some patterns that are repeated when you consider the gimmick, like being into this gimmick to know where you have to, recreating or creating or emphasizing an identity to be able to get what you want, or to do something that's like, it's subversion. Like, so I found that very, very interesting, that aspect, let's say.
Thanks, Katya. I found that there was a lot of echoes in our work because there's some similar methodological interest, but thank you for also pointing out the importance of agency. I think this is one of the chapters I enjoyed the most because there was this like such an agential act by this historical figure to instrumentalize indigeneity and the discourses of miscegenation to like get what he wants. And I thought about it in a very crude way because he just like is so obsessed with his white lover, but then they end up being married for a long time and they die together. Like it was like a very important narrative to be reading amongst an archive of a lot of violence and tragedy. So yeah, the gimmick was really important for me in this chapter.
Great. Thank you very much. And let's all thank Tavleen again for sharing her work.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.
And I'll take the opportunity to thank everyone for coming out and also remind you that on Monday we have our last talk in the Doctoral Fellows, Savages and Sauvages, American Indigenous Characters in French and English Colonial Satire with Rob Twist, who's here right now. And then on Friday, March 26th, I encourage everyone to come out online to our Northrop Frye Center annual lecture. This year, The Scarlet Thread, Unraveling the Fabric of Crime with Professor Alison Matthews David from Ryerson. And as well, we